So I'm Alyssa DeFilippo, Director of Parent Services at Matrix, and I have the pleasure of introducing Colleen Arnold. Colleen has worked as a special education teacher, a curriculum consultant, and a parent advocate in Marin and Sonoma for over 10 years in both the non-public and public sector. She serves on the Matrix board and is the woman behind the wildly popular Sensitive Santa in Marin. Details coming shortly. Dr. Arnold recently received her doctorate in special education at University of San Francisco. Is that right? In special education, not education, okay. And today we'll be presenting on her dissertation topic, the delayed echolalia. So welcome, Colleen.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, and thank you, Erica. I'm looking around. Welcome to all the familiar faces, both clients, professionals, parents. It's so nice to have you guys with us today. And I'm really excited to speak on just a topic that obviously I devoted 6 years of my life to. So hopefully I still enjoy speaking about it, but a topic that really inspires me and I find really fascinating. So the topic today is flipping the script. And my dissertation focused on prioritizing the autistic voice in the understanding of scripting. There's a lot of vocabulary today, so I will be kind of doing a little review of that. Again, please put your questions in the chat. I hope to get to all of them. If not, we can also follow up after. I know we have a lot of people joining us today. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. And we are going to get rolling. All right, of course, part of the whole model of the approach and the way that we look at communication is respecting all modes of communication. So I just want to start off by saying whatever you need today to communicate and participate effectively, camera on, camera off, if you need to move around, if you're like me and you need to sit and write notes, whatever your modes are, I really just appreciate you being here. So please do so as comfortably as you can. One question I would like to ask, and in my realm, we do a lot of signs. Zoom can be really challenging for people to participate in. So we use a lot of sign language, chat, and alternate modes of eliciting participation. So first, just getting to know our audience, and I'll scan through my friends here. If you can give me a sign language A, if you are primarily here as a parent, or a B, if you are here as a professional. And we might have a C option as well, which could be both. I should have put that one up there too. Yeah, I see some B's, I see some C's. Oh, there's a couple A's in there too. Amazing. So it really is a good balance, I can see, of both parent and professional. So that will help me to shape how I kind of really through the whole presentation, I was thinking of both of you. So hopefully we balance kind of both of your needs throughout today. I also, with the sign piece, we do a lot of agree. So if you do kind of like a surf's up sign, and if something resonates with you, showing the agree sign can really show if something hits you that you agree with. Okay, so when we talk about research and we quote articles and we get all intellectual, I think it's super important for me to come back to the individuals and to come back for the reasons that we're here today, whether you're a parent, a BCBA, a teacher, my mom, all of whom are here today, very exciting. The reason why we are here is thinking about the individual student. And for me, the term delayed echolalia crossed my consciousness probably about 8 years ago. And this is an actual drawing done by one of my all-time favorite friends who was one of those kids who challenged me, kept me up at night, and always made me want to be a better educator. And he was an amazing artist, clearly. Besides being an amazing artist, he used delayed echolalia as a form of communication. He would quote, he was very much into Sesame Street. So a lot of lines from Sesame Street, a lot of songs. And as a teacher, to be honest, at that time, I was really challenged in how to respect his form of communication, because I did view it as that, but also not feel like I was constantly pausing him, because it can be challenging in a classroom setting to work with a student who scripts as often as this little guy did. So it really just helped shape and kind of push me towards understanding, and I'll use both terms in my presentation, delayed echolalia and scripting, but to really understand where this was coming from for him and how it impacts those of us who are working with kids with autism. So I will always come back to my friend and how he piqued my curiosity. So we're gonna kind of talk bigger picture. Even if you don't have experience with delayed echolalia or your child doesn't use scripting, some of just the understanding of disability, I think, is really helpful for all of us who work or parent someone with autism, and also just for all of us who live in a society with people with disabilities and who may need to reflect on and reframe our thinking about disability. So I'll talk about some of the previous literature, which is fascinating, and then I'll move on to my own original research, which was conducted in 2019, and from which I hope to end with really some clear kind of strategies to improve communication when we're working with people with autism. And then, like we said, we'll also address questions throughout and through the chat. So when I wrote this slide, I was thinking to myself, there are going to be some of you who hear these terms and it may be really new. And for some of you, I may be preaching to the choir. So I want to respect both views. But this research today really focuses on what we call the neurodiversity model. And can I see a thumbs up? I know it. I've heard it, but I'm not quite sure. Thumbs down. What does that term mean? Okay, awesome. I'm just flipping through. It's hard. You guys are small when you're in this. Okay, great. So when I think about the neurodiversity model and the social view of disability, and my choice, and you guys noticed that, I'm sure, in the sign up that I did use the word autistic person as opposed to person with autism. What it really is looking at is that autism is an integral part of a person's identity. And so I do quote this, this article of Brown in 2015. So if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend that reading. But part of this lens of neurodiversity is thinking about, you know, linguistic diversity, ethnic diversity, how our society thrives when difference is accepted and celebrated. And that neurodiversity is similar. So when we talk about people with autism, when we talk about people with dyslexia or different learning approaches, recognizing that that feeds into the diversity of our whole society. And so through that lens led me to use, you know, and again, I will flip back and forth because I was schooled in a very traditional special education programming, but identifying that use of identity first language versus person with, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also I actively chose to use the term scripting versus delayed echolalia. And I'll also address that in another slide as to why. But really the shift of this lens, and those of you who have been in IEPs or have been through a diagnosis with your child, you can really probably attest and agree to the fact that there's so much deficit emphasis in this, in the special education disability world. You know, you feel like you sit at this meeting with 15 people and they talk about all the things your child cannot do. And this method is really shifting from that deficit view and looking at the strengths, looking at how do we play on the strengths to support the child, and then also looks at how does the society really create those barriers for people with disabilities, that maybe can we look beyond the disability itself and how the othering and, you know, kind of the isolating can really impact everyone who identifies with a disability. So I love this visual. And again, I challenge, I know this may not sit with everybody. This is kind of a very progressive point of view as far as the language we use, and language is so important. So I just want to put this visual out there that came from, is kind of grounded in Brown's 2015 argument. And the way she frames it is just so beautifully. And she puts that, autism is inherent to identity, that the goal of everyone fighting for proper terminology is to humanize autistic people. That is across the board our goal. But that in this perspective, the person cannot be separated from their autism. So if you look at, here it is as an accessory, and this is how some people view it. When you say person with autism, you're suggesting that you can separate a person from their neurology. And what this argument is saying is that just like, the color of your own skin or your culture or heritage, this cannot be separated from you.
Webinar.
I think we have to mute somebody. Does anybody think? Sorry, I can't see who it is. Thank you. But that when we use the term autistic person, we're really recognizing that this is a part of who I am, and therefore it should be respected and prioritized. And I think the next slide helps us to see that in a recent study, 2015, 61% of the people surveyed, of 502 autistic people, did prefer this language. So I think what's really important, obviously, number one, we call people by name, but is to also be clear on what the person themselves prefers, what type of language. And as a parent, if you are making that choice, obviously, for your child right now, to really do some reading and see how your family and your kind of cultural group feel about the language that you use. So again, it was an active choice that we made through the research. Okay, so now I'm gonna kind of try to nail down a couple of these terms: delayed echolalia versus scripting. And so the first piece I want, I'll say delayed echolalia a lot because I've read 700 research articles that use that term, right? So it's very, very research based as far as what researchers use. Essentially, historically, the emphasis has always been on it as a behavior. And I see my behaviorists out there. Hey, guys. But traditionally in the research, it's seen as a behavior, and it's seen the majority of the articles that write about it talk about it as something to be eradicated, something you want to change and end. The argument is that in traditional research, the autistic voice isn't really there, right? So the researcher is kind of the end all be all. And it really lacks the understanding, and myself having reviewed many, many articles that look at delayed echolalia, it lacks the understanding of what the benefits are. Not only self-regulation, but the communication benefits. And that's really where my research was looking to fill. So the term scripting is more often used by the autistic community. If you look on blogs or people who are advocates in the community, this is a term that's more often used. And when this term is used, there is kind of an assumption there that it has a communicative function. It's not just this, I just repeat movie lines over and over as a form of stim. It really is this understanding that there's more. But definitely these terms can be used synonymously, so that's confusing. So as much as I tried to kind of delineate into these two clear columns, what you will notice out in the world is that some people do use the term simultaneously. And I will say, historically, looking at delayed echolalia, back in the day, we were using some pretty offensive techniques to get people to stop echoing or using this form of communication. Prezant talks about teachers clapping in children's faces loudly to get them to stop, squirting lemon juice in their mouths. So there's definitely kind of this history behind it. And there was a recent review also in 2018, where there was 568 articles looked at, and 0 of them looked at the function or the why that the child was using this form of language. So I think that's just important to kind of keep in our mind as we go through this. And, you know, when I think about scripting, I really think about this Gestalt language processing, which is when we think about little kids when they learn language. So often it's memorized, right? It's imitation is the very building block of language. And there's a story about a little boy named Aiden. When he was 3 years old, he'd never said hello to people. He didn't have that communication tool at that time in his belt. And instead, he adopted an entire phrase that he would use when being introduced to someone. And the first thing he would say was, "Are you a good witch or a bad witch?" And I just think, wow, what a great example of, you know, he's using this echo, obviously from Wizard of Oz, I'm assuming, and he is not only using it as a greeting, but it's almost as a check. Like, who are you? Can you be trusted, right? So oftentimes these gestalts, these kind of big chunks of language, for typically developing children as well, it's a part of the linguistic learning process. And I think that's really important to respect and recognize. I want to use that button, but it doesn't want me to. So just some terms that we're going to go over today. And again, this is in your handout, so you can take some time to look that over. We talked already about echolalia. My presentation is really emphasized on delayed, right? It's words that were heard earlier in time and then are repeated later. It's really funny when you're the source of the echo. I've had that with some of my students where I can hear my own tone and inflection. I had one little friend who anytime he was called on, he would say, "Come on down to The Price is Right," and in my accent. And I realized that I would use that as a phrase to kind of get students excited about participating. So that's always fun when you get to hear yourself parroted back at you. Neologism, this green bubble, is another word that will come up, and it's thinking about the use of a word in a new way. And I'll explain some examples of that later, but thinking about an echo that may be used perhaps not in the context you would expect it. So unless you're really familiar with the child and you've had a lot of communication time with them, it might be really easy to misconstrue. And then the other piece I want to point out is down here in the bottom left in red, which is mitigated echolalia. And one of the things I was really interested in is how do these echoes change over time? So for example, with our little guy we just discussed, Aiden, are you a good witch or a bad witch? That was an echo he held on to. As he grew and developed, my curiosity was, does his echoes, do they change? Do they change to fit a circumstance, or if he has a different experience? And so that was something that really drove my research as well. So I'm going to share a little video now of just a great, if you're still feeling like I'm trying to grapple and understand how these echoes can be meaningful. This story about Jeff, I'm hopeful, will help you to see that. Give me a thumbs up if you've got my image of a school. Excellent. Thank you.
In an article written by Present in 2015, he describes the story of Jeff, a young man with autism. One day, when Jeff arrived at school, his teachers immediately noticed that he was behaving a bit differently. Jeff had a lot less energy than usual, and he began approaching the adults in the classroom with his mouth open, making a noise like do-ah, do-ah. This script continued throughout the day, and his teachers were having a very hard time figuring out what it was that Jeff was trying to communicate. Upon chatting with Jeff's mother, who could be referred to as a familiar listener, she did not hesitate and immediately understood that Jeff was trying to communicate that he wasn't feeling well. Oftentimes, when Jeff is getting sick, She may ask him to open his mouth and do ah. It made perfect sense. Jeff was trying to tell us that he didn't feel well. He had a cold or maybe a sore throat. At his stage, he was unable to use spontaneous language and therefore was acting out a scene, using a script to share what he needed to get his needs met.
Okay, so this is probably one of my favorite examples because it's so easy to see how clearly his teachers were in tune with him. They knew something was off. And yet, because they weren't, the term I use is a familiar listener, like his mom was, they didn't understand what this script meant. And I think what often happens with misunderstandings like this is we might write it off as, oh, he's just, not able to communicate or he's being silly. When in reality, in this example, he really was effectively, if his mom had been around, would have been effectively communicating his wants and his needs. Oh, sorry about that.
In an article written by
Okay, so when we think about communication and scripting, there is while I did mention that a lot of the research emphasizes, the behavioral strategies in order to build more functional communication, there is a lot of good research that looks at how is it used to communicate. And so through my reading, as I was building my own study, I had to really understand what was already out there. So these are some of the forms of communication that were already interacted in the research. I think one great example is expressing understanding. I found a lot of examples of students who would use an echo, perhaps that their teacher had used before, or in order to show that they understood a direction. So David was one example where anytime he heard the word no, he would repeat, "We don't slam doors, we don't pee on the wall." And what he was doing was wrapping his mind around the rules, right? So at one point he had gotten perhaps, a talking to about the wall and about doors. And this became kind of his scripting mantra, where when he had a new rule to add, he would repeat this script. We already heard about Jeff, who communicated the feeling of being sick through an echo of repeating his mom and the do ah. Also, there can be self-monitoring strategies and self-regulation. And I think we have somebody who's off mute. I think that the self-regulation piece, many of you see a lot. We can look at self-stimulation, or when a student is really anxious, sometimes we see the scripts come out. And sometimes that's not only, it can be a real calming mechanism. And we'll talk more about that when I talk about my own research. So what else does the research tell us from the past? We know that scripts can change over time. And this is an excellent story about Bud. And Bud was super into the Teletubbies. That was his, I know, agree? Yeah, no, not as a parent. No, thank you. The Teletubbies were his thing. And he had these scripts from the show that he would repeat over and over. One of them was, "Quick, Dipsy, help Lala catch the ball." And his parents heard the script over and over. It was one of his favorites. Until one day, Bud was in a situation with his parents and his siblings, and they were playing ball. And Bud used what we call mitigated scripting. He took this script that he knew as a whole, and he altered it to fit the context of what was happening around him. So he wanted to play ball. And so he said, "Quick, Daddy, help Bud catch the ball." And his parents kind of, looked up in surprise because they had heard this script so many times before. And here was Bud, who communicated mostly through scripts and not as much spontaneous speech, taking a script and changing it in a really meaningful way to help him get access to what he wanted. So that's just why, for me, mitigated scripting is so important, is how does this language adapt and evolve over time to help us become even better communicators? What we also know is there is a strong emotional connection, and agree if you've seen it with your own kids who script. There are times when they're really looking for that back and forth and that want to interact while scripting. And I think, for me, especially as an educator, trying to become a familiar listener, really understanding the context of the scripts was really helpful. So one of our students that I work with now, it's a lot of Dora the Explorer. And I actually had to dive into that show to help connect with her and to really figure out what was the draw and how can I bring it in, to our lessons together to motivate and connect. I also want to point out the inflection. So the friend that I shared on the first slide, he could mimic the voice to a T. That's how I knew when it was mine. That's how I knew when it was, Elmo or whomever it was. So there, you can also see that tone and that kind of inflection with some individuals who script. Okay, so anyone read this book? You can give me a yes or a no. Okay. All of a sudden, delayed echolalia, I feel like, was kind of this hidden term that was used, perhaps in behavior reports and in the research. And then it really hit the mainstream with Ron Suskind. And he was a reporter / writer and had a son, has a son named Owen, and wrote really honestly about his family's experience. And I think this is when it really became kind of more of a common kind of household word, especially for people who are involved in working with people with autism. So this story is fascinating to me, and I just pulled out, I could quote this book all day because it really has some solid examples, but there's a couple of things I want to point out. I want to point out that at the beginning of the story, it really goes through the evolution of the family, right? And the family feeling a lot of pressure because Disney is often, for a lot of our kiddos, a huge interactional resource, but can also be very isolating. So his son was really his sole interest. All he wanted to do was watch Disney movies. And at the suggestion of the therapist, they felt like it was too much. And so the TV got locked up, literally. Locked up, and then, very small amounts that they were using. I'm trying to recall if it was as rewards but it really became stressful for the whole family. And at the time, Owen did not have a whole lot of spontaneous speech. Most of his communication was through, repeating lines from Disney. But then all of a sudden, during the struggling transition, there were a couple things that Owen stated as he got a little bit older that made the family realize how much Disney was teaching him about relationships. So at one point, his brother had a birthday party, and he was really upset, and he was having a bit of a meltdown, and he was crying. And Owen came to his dad and said, "Walter doesn't want to grow up like Mowgli or Peter Pan." And his dad, first of all, what an insightful thing for a young man to say, to connect his brother's tears at his birthday to a fear of growing up. But then also you can see he recognized this emotion through the characters in Disney films that also didn't want to grow up. The other point I wanted to share is a story about using the Iago. Is it Iago puppet? So he is a character from Aladdin. And the dads just started realizing, like, this locking up the TV is not working. The only way I can tap into my son is through these movies. So what they started to do is watch them more as a family. They started to do reenactments of some of his favorite scenes because he used to like to get stuck on one scene and rewind it and watch it over and over, which wasn't as pleasurable for the rest of the family, I would imagine. So they had to try to compromise and kind of work all of this out. But one night he was role playing with Owen and was using the puppet. You can see his little picture in the corner of the page. And he responded that he wasn't happy. And I'm going to quote this directly because I couldn't say it any better. He said, "I'm not happy. I don't have friends. I can't understand what people say." And Ron just noticed like his son's language had never been so natural and so real and so open as when he was talking to his little friend, the puppet. It almost took the pressure off the social interaction. So this was really a link, and really helped, I think, a lot of us in the community to see the benefits of what, you know, at one point we may have just seen as self-stimulation or escaping from the world. So in my research, one of the things that was really important to me was to not just read research articles written by doctors. Because there is so much more to research, especially if you read about the autistic community and how they use, you know, social media and writing and blogs to share their thoughts. So that was something I dove into really deeply. And I thought this quote just really kind of dovetailed on Owen's experiences, which is sharing our passions with people we love is how we show we care and how we connect with you. And those are passions, those are enthusiasms, those are, you know, quote unquote obsessions, right? But I think the key is recognizing that what our kids love and are into and are often very, very good at can really be a deep connection to them. Okay, so I'm going to allow the autistic voices to speak a little bit more for us through this next video.
Now, let's utilize the expertise of the autistic voice on the benefits of scripting. When I was 6, I could play a board game with only slightly more meltdown potential than any other little kids. At 30, board games have largely given way to unstructured conversations where turn taking is marked not by handing over the dice, but by nonverbal cues. The length of turns and what a turn includes varies moment to moment. Talking too much, not enough, oddly, gets noticed. Not catching nuance, it shows. Echolalia stands out. The skills that make you slide by in first grade are not enough in adulthood. There's nowhere to hide. Echolalia is a fancy word for the repetition of spoken words. For typical toddlers, it's a transitional period in language development. For autistic people who don't have functional language skills, it's a means of communication. For me, it feels like a kind of found speech, similar to the cast-off pieces of pipe and rusted metal that an artist might use to make a sculpture. We aren't good at conversation, and however hard we try, we'll never speak as effortlessly as you do. The big exception, however, is words or phrases we're familiar with. Repeating these is great fun. It's like a game of catch with a ball. Unlike the words we're ordered to say, repeating questions we already know the answers to can be a pleasure. It's playing with sound and rhythm.
Okay, so what I would love to do is take a look at the chat for a second. I'm going to stop my share because sometimes it's really hard for me to do that and talk and see you guys at the same time. So I'm going to pause my share because we're about to kind of dive in. You know, we've talked a bunch about the vocabulary and about what the research says, but we're about to kind of dive into the original research and some of the questions that after I read all of these articles that I had for myself. And so I'm curious to see, I'm looking at the chat just to see if we have any questions so far. I also am wanting to, I think as we go through the study, I'm going to focus on the first section, but if anyone's more interested in, there's a follow-up kind of a part 2, we can share that as well. So I don't see any questions in the chat right now. Erica, I don't know if any came directly to you, and if not.
Nope, looks good.
All right, well, let's definitely feel free to use the chat, and I'm gonna kind of get started on the second part, which is really focusing on my own original research and what I found through, see, it's gonna play just to annoy me. There we go.
Now let's utilize.
Gotta love the sound of your own voice over and over. It's delightful. Okay, so as I discussed, I conducted my research in 2019 and then haven't looked at it since. No, that's only partially true. I am wearing it around my neck. It's on a scarf, thanks to my sister who is somewhere in the crowd right now. So essentially the idea was I wanted to look at scripting, but I wanted to frame it around the autistic voice. So much of the research wasn't giving people with autism the forefront to really speak about their experiences. And I wanted to use that as a guide, as a professional, but also as someone who mentors families to frame a general understanding of scripting. Something that I also found really fascinating was the idea of the familiar listener and how the listener can impact how a child communicates. And we already saw that, with the do-ah example, that the listener absolutely does have an impact on what happens. So those were essentially the main purposes. And then I had a variety of research questions that I'm not going to bore you all with, but I really wanted to understand the key of communication. And I was also interested in thinking about, as a neurotypical individual, which that's who I am. I relate as a neurotypical. How can I assist someone with autism in building and improving their communication in a really meaningful way? And in a way that feels safe and like I'm not silencing their mode of communication. I also looked at the evolution of scripting, which we talked about, that mitigated script and how it changes over time, which was really, really fascinating to me. Okay, so quickly got to do methods. These are for the research geeks out there. When we look at special education research, you're generally finding qualitative methods. Quantitative methods are really challenging to get the sample size that you need to get statistically significant information. That's all I'll say about that now. Some of you care about that, I can tell. But I did utilize an online survey data. It was actually a national level, but I actually did get some participants from out of the country, which was really fascinating. It was sent out to people 18 and older. I actually created a pilot, and one of the individuals on my dissertation committee is an autistic adult who is also getting his doctorate and is a huge advocate for the autism community. And he actually assisted in the format of my questions. He kind of took it as a pilot and said, Colleen, you cannot ask a question this open-ended. We're never going to be able to answer it. So I got some good feedback about how to really streamline it. But then also, making sure that the format was as like I had intended to do follow-up phone interviews, and he just really discouraged that. He felt like online and using media was the best way to get the most active participants, which I totally agree. And I did a lot of coding methodology. I chose in vivo coding, which essentially is the verbatim principle. So for example, if I was picking a code, so when you're coding, you're taking all these tidbits of data, and the words and the sharing are all data to be looked at. And what I was trying to do is keep the data authentic by using the participants' own words to categorize the data. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that later. But my goal was really to make sure that myself as the researcher, being non-autistic, that I didn't impact the research with my own bias or my own perspectives. And so yes, lots of coding. Coding is fun. But what were the results? So I had 22 participants, and again, even a couple outside of the United States. They aged from 22 to 65 years old. There's some gender data that's really fascinating that I would love to look at through another study. But there was, a 22% reported gender nonconforming. That was an option that I kept, obviously left open into the survey. So that was some interesting results. And then I did do a follow-up in-depth interview using a live Google Doc, which was also really fascinating. But I think that's going to be for another day for a part 2. So we're going to really focus on those who completed the survey, the 22 participants, and what data was gained from that information. So this is an example of what the questions looked like. So at one point, at the beginning of the survey, I asked about scripting. Everyone was attracted to my survey, kind of already knew what the topic was. So you'll see obviously a really large percentage were like, yeah, I think it was only one participant who had not, but she was actually the parent of a young man with autism who scripted. So she had kind of a different perspective, which was interesting. But you can see kind of how the data panned out here. Okay, so again, it all comes back to the individual, right? And the stories. And that's what I find, so fascinating and so important from the research. What we did, it was really me. It's like we say we, but what I did was I looked at the benefits and I tried to really categorize them. And when we looked at all the coding, we found 3 major categories: communication, comfort, and career success. And then we had to look at communication and really break it down even further because we had so much data about how scripting is used as a form of communication. So if you look at the next slide, what you'll notice is that communication is further broken down. And it's broken down into complex thoughts and emotions. Small talk was a big trigger for our friends on the spectrum. Some of us maybe agree that small talk is very challenging. And then stressful situations. So these were the 3 most commonly reported communication situations where scripting was the most beneficial. And, I will quote my participants. They were all anonymous. So I won't refer to names, but one quote that came out of this section was, "I don't know what to say a lot of times to people." That was, how one of our participants felt. So let's look a little bit more deeply into some of these benefits. So when we're looking at communication, the small talk, like I mentioned, was huge. Starting a conversation, ending a conversation. A big part that was reported was fear of making a mistake. And I think about myself, when a waiter says to you, like, "Have a great meal," and you're like, "You too," and how we just as humans, especially when it comes to small talk, we rely on scripts as well. And sometimes we over rely and we make a mistake and we tell our waiter we hope he has a good dinner. So I think that's really relatable, even as a kind of more typical communicator. The communication of complex thoughts and emotions, we've kind of discussed some examples there. One thing that jumped out at me hugely that I really think as professionals and parents, we really need to think about is the stressful situations component. And what I really concluded was during times of stress, to silence the script is to silence the person. And that to me, like, even just saying it, I get like chills, because that to me was very, very humbling. And I thought about my little friend at the beginning and the times when I would pause him. And that was literally our thing because it helped. I would ask him to pause the video in his head so he could be present. And sometimes I look back at those times and I think, oh my gosh, what was I missing? So many of our participants communicated that in stressful situations, when they felt bullied, when they had a challenging client, when they were scared, the quotes were, "My words would get stolen. I was less verbal than I was expected to be." And I think this one really sums it up. "I'm often left completely nonverbal at times when I most need to be able to speak." And that really hit me. And I think as adults, we can all relate to when under stress. You can be a very engaging communicator, a very clear didactic speaker. And maybe if you're caught off guard or you feel threatened or you're in, an unfamiliar situation, your communication skills change, right? You're not at the top of your game. But again, I want to come back to this phrase, which is to silence the script, is to silence the person. And that to me was the hugest takeaway here. So let's learn a little bit more about what came out of the research in regards, out of my research in regards to higher level communication, because I thought this was really fascinating.
In more complex, higher level communication exchanges, autistic adults report that scripts can be beneficial to use as a shortcut. One contributor related it to the use of a meme, a quick and easy way to express and explain complex feelings or thoughts. Complex feelings may be difficult to express using single words or phrases, and thus are borrowed and become scripts. As one participant described, they're kind of like shortcuts for communicating a lot of ideas at once, emotions that have no name and can pack complex information into easily digestible bits. Using these scripts to express this type of complex thinking was also described as easier for autistic adults, as, quote, it's easier to communicate complex thoughts by proxy. One participant shared they may use words or idioms from movies, memes, etc., without being able or have the choice to put it on different terms. This is a critical point, as this contributor provides an example of when using a script is their only option in regards to sharing a complex thought with others. This was a common theme throughout the research, that oftentimes autistic individuals would utilize scripts when they were in situations, whether due to stress or the complexity of the emotion they were trying to convey, this was the most impactful way to communicate.
Okay, so we talked a bit about the stressful piece. And I think that when we're talking about people with autism, the stress can often lead to overstimulation and shutdown. And so the scripting piece can be a real, can be a real great way to avoid that. So having those prepared scripts when individuals were talking about entering a stressful situation, specifically like a job interview where they have that control, they know ahead of time it's going to be stressful, that they could prepare in that way. And I think, I have a couple of visuals that I just want to share, but understanding that language is flexible, it's on a continuum, and you may have certain expectations for your child or your client because they have X level of skills in regards to communication, but realizing that that fluctuates. So when we think about just autism in general, and, autism is a spectrum, which has changed a lot, the way we think about autism in the last 5 years, sometimes people look at it as this very linear scale, right? This dichotomy. And I have this from parents so often with kids, especially our super verbal, bright, quirky, communicative kiddos that maybe fall on the line, right? But what this visual is telling us is, we as humans often want this box linear thinking. Is it yes? Is it no? Is it this? Is it that? Help me understand you. Let me put you in this box so I know exactly what to expect. But it isn't this straightforward, right? Instead, it looks a bit more like this. So all of the components of autism are falling on these different wavelengths. You might have an autistic child whose motor skills are really, really challenging, but their language is really strong, right? So it's not just those terms, which I don't enjoy, high versus low functioning, right? Because they can just poorly reflect an individual. I wouldn't want to be referred to as high or low functioning anything, right? But what is more meaningful is to understand how they fall within these components that are often, we know sensory is a huge component for people on the spectrum. But the other piece is that this is a continuum that is impacted, and I have my own little visual I started drawing kind of around it, the environmental factors that can impact the way a child would fall on this given any moment. So I put what the environment is, how prepared are they for the environment? Is the environment predictable? Are there a lot of visuals? What's the task? How much practice have they had at this task? Is it comfortable? Does it feel safe? Who is involved? What's the sensory input that they're experiencing, right? So all of this, I mean, it's messy because life is messy, right? But that simple scale of high to low functioning, it's just not reflective. And absolutely the adults in my research would validate that fact. So this is just a great visual to ponder over. Okay, so what other benefits did we come up with in our results? Comfort. I think I see some friends that I know who perhaps they're little individuals enjoy scripting, right? There is some pleasure in it. There's some fun. There's some wordplay, or the way the sounds sound to their ears. My participants use the term soothing. There's a pleasure of repeating a phrase, something satisfying to say that plays with sound. There's definitely a self-regulation component here as well. Okay, and the career success came up, which was actually a pretty big number. 32% of all participants talked about scripting in their jobs. They talked about, honestly, email scripts, which, you know, how they use the written word and plan out and think about who they're working with. A lot of emphasis on avoiding offending people in the workplace. I thought that was really real, right? Especially if you have people who are really honest, which is a quality of a lot of my friends that I've worked with in the past, is that honesty and that filter, which can be challenging. So to avoid making mistakes, that was really what was shared in the research. I'm more successful if I can avoid making mistakes, and I can avoid making mistakes if I plan ahead. Which, hey, I'm on board with that. That's for sure. Okay, so we've been super positive, which is how, you know, I always like to roll. But I do think it's also important to recognize the complexity of having a different communication style. So what are the barriers that came up? And this is super, you know, real for all of our participants. There was 67% of our participants reported negative reactions of others. So this kind of comes back to what's disabling. Is it the disability or the way that our society handles it and or accepts or not accepts personal differences? So the things that came up and were coded the most often were isolation, embarrassment, and negative assumptions. Quote, I didn't communicate with anyone often as a child. They made me feel embarrassed and ashamed of it. I was not really communicated with in childhood, but it was more being communicated to. The words retarded, annoying, and strange were most reported in regards to the way that others described their scripting. Something actually fascinating that I'd love to dive into more in a follow-up was also how the neurology of the listener impacted the scripting. So many of my participants who have built themselves autistic communities, whether it's in person or online, talk about how scripting is different if the other person is of shared neurological difference. One of the participants, her two siblings, it's 3 girls, and all 3 are diagnosed with autism, and she speaks about how their scripts were so much different and so much differently received than when she'd communicate with neurotypical individuals. So that was kind of a fascinating piece as well. Many people spoke about how they failed either way. If they were scripted, they were viewed as being not real or false. And if they were unscripted, AKA themselves, they were viewed as being too harsh or too aggressive or not following the social rules enough. So obviously that's a conundrum, right? And we're talking about adults who have developed these coping skills really over the years. Okay, so what other barriers did we find? So for our therapists out there, I see you, this is a really good one. Over-reliance on scripting. So when I think about like functional communication training or, these great research-based strategies that we have to help our kids build communication, one of my really, really insightful participants talked about her frustration when scripts were they were like overgeneralized. Like every time someone says this, you should say this. And she felt like scripting needs to be more nuanced, otherwise it becomes stifling. Like every time someone says, do you want to do this? You should say this. It's like, well, what if I don't want to say that? So I think it's important to recognize the nuance of it. And that, the autistic client should not be ignoring their own feelings in order to placate a social issue all the time. There's also obviously misinterpretation with scripting, especially when we're talking about people who are not familiar listeners, right? So maybe they don't get the reference. Maybe it's seen like they're mocking somebody or making fun. And then the last piece is a pressure to fit in. And this is really fascinating, you guys, because when I originally coded fitting in, I didn't word it in this way. I called it fitting in. I coded it as a benefit, right? I'm thinking about, okay, well, what do we want? We want our kids to fit in. We want to fit in. We want to belong. But as I dove into it, I recognized the danger that masking our real selves can really have, especially for people with disabilities who feel like they're never truly themselves. So I think that's an important piece to look at as well. So I wanted to include this quote because I thought it was that important. This is from participant 7. Again, I don't like the numbers, but it's all anonymous. So I have started to assert my own opinion more and follow expected taught social scripts. Oh, less. Thank you for that. Typo. I got tired of how I was missing out on life because I was so focused on saying the right thing at the right time and not being awkward that I was missing out on the actual context of what was going on. And people were calling me dumb and robotic while others still tell me that I'm not following the social scripting right and I need to try harder. I think those words really just say it all. Okay, so when thinking about the features of scripting, mitigated scripts, it was almost like my participants were like, duh, of course scripts change over time. Like, what are you talking about? And why don't you understand this yet? I felt this way a lot through this process. It's like, I'm tapping into a world where, people in the autistic community who script, they already know all of this to be true. And they're just kind of shocked that I had to do a study to confirm it. So that was humbling, but also really important. So absolutely, scripting changes over time. It becomes nuanced, it adapts, it becomes more subtle. One of my participants called herself a heavy masker and said the whole idea is that my scripts aren't noticed. So as I became older and more able, no, you don't know that I'm scripting. If you did, it would be beside the point. So, we're talking about how complex these patterns can become over time. And then the neologisms, thinking about, I had a poet as one of my participants, and he had a lot of pretty much all of his scripts are poetry. And so, he quoted this one poem about offering someone a glass of wine. And he said, well, when I do this in the moment, you think I'm just asking you if you want wine, but really I'm expressing the whole feeling of this like 10 stanza poem, but you have no idea. So I thought that was really fascinating. That oftentimes the meaning has more depth than perhaps you or I would pick up unless we knew the original source and we really understood it. And again, the neurology, obviously, of the listeners being super, super important. Okay, so what I want to do now is the goal really of all of this is how does this support us as parents, as humans in the community who are interacting with people with autism, whether through work or school or just in general in life. And so one of the things you'll find in the email is the strategies and supports to improve communication handout. So here's what was really challenging for me. Here I am on kind of the soapbox saying we need to listen to the people. It's this whole nothing about us without us mentality, right? You can't write an article as a researcher talking about autism when you haven't involved us in this process of helping you to understand it. So when I'm getting to my conclusion section and I have to have conclusions, I have to have, some tips and some real applicable ideas for how to improve communication. How do I do that in a way that's meaningful and not demeaning to this whole purpose and process? And so the way that my team and I decided to do that was to, when we made a recommendation, always include a direct quote from a participant that we were basing that recommendation on. Does that make sense? So it wasn't just, here I am, an expert telling you what's right. Here I am taking what an expert said, an actual person with autism, and I'm turning it into something concrete that you can do to actually improve your interactions. So that's kind of how this little 2-page handout kind of evolved. So let me share my screen. And again, this is a PDF that was in your, there's half my daughter's face. It's always fun when you screen share and it doesn't take up the whole. There we go. Okay. Okay, so what strategies, what do we do? We have all these, now we understand a bit more about scripting. We understand that there are benefits, but that society is also putting a lot of pressure on autistic young adults and adults. The part 2 of my research really focused on some of the anxiety and depression that my clients or that my participants experience later in life, all kind of related to the masking component, right? So one of my participants stated that it was interesting because when she was at her lowest, right around age 16 or 17, which, when we talk about anxiety and depression in adolescence, obviously that's a really pivotal point for many who struggle with depression. But she talks about how just when she had hit, in her mind, her lowest, her family thought she was being the most successful. So that was really fascinating that she had masked so well into this persona. She had lost herself so much that she felt so depressed, but from the external, she looked more well-adjusted. And that was really, it was really her data that helped me realize that fitting in this instance was not actually a benefit, but it was actually, one of the hurdles, even though, like I said, we all want it. So it's a challenge. Okay. So looking at the first strategy, the first thing that this research is supporting is that scripting has a multitude of benefits and that restricting that scripting can have very negative implications. Right. And the quote is looking at survival. right? That people with autism use this tool as survival to relieve social anxiety. So I think just coming from that place of, I know this is serving a purpose for you already as parents, professionals, we're in a different mindset. We're not looking solely at the script as disruptive, annoying, pointless, right? We're already coming from a lens of love and support and understanding. The second strategy is to use the scripting as a way to connect, build relationships and understanding. Now, is this appropriate all the time, 24/7? No, but can we make some rules around it? Can we dedicate some time where we really allow ourselves to be pulled into our students' child's client's world? So this was one of my participants talked about how much she used Disney movies to communicate with her dad, and how, you know, that time watching those movies together was how she connected. Much like Owen from Ron's book. Making sure that if we do use scripting, since it is a really great tool, that we have to use flexible scripts. We have to think about how scripting fits when we talk about our kids out there in the world getting jobs and being successful and working out in the community. So how do we use those scripts to help them? Because a huge percentage of my participants talked about how beneficial they were, and how scripting really helps them to be a professional in the environment. I think alongside that is teaching the nuances. And so this was that quote I was referring to earlier. The kind of scripting I don't like is when I am taught that situation X always requires response Y, no matter how the context or how I feel. And we all know that scripting or any type of communication is more complicated than that, right? So to give choices, to talk about, well, what if you don't want to go to the party? What are some scripts that we can build to agree to something? And can we also have some scripts to acceptably decline, right? I mean, I think we all those people, all those of us that say yes to everything, I think we would benefit from some of those scripts as well, right? I talked about how understanding the scripts can be so eye-opening, right? Learning the scripts and the meaning, going back to that original source. Go watch some Dora. It's actually really riveting. So essentially, you know, a lot of my participants talked about how in order to really understand them, you have to know, right? To recognize the sources to really understand the script. Look for deep opportunities to connect. This wild talk made me laugh. So our follow-up interviewee, I actually got to interview the dad. And he talks about, this is kind of fascinating for our therapists that have joined us today. He talks about how he used to lie to the therapists because he was supposed to walk out of the room every time his daughter started scripting, because they were trying to work on her more functional communication. And he used to, every night after dinner, they would script together and they would kind of dive into it. And he called it her wild talk. And when the therapist would ask about it, he would say, "Oh yeah, I'm sticking to the behavior plan," but he wasn't. And to be honest, she really appreciated him breaking the rules, because she really identified with him as her main source of support during some really challenging times. Viewing language skills as a continuum, right? That beautiful rainbow visual we talked about, versus just that flat line of high-low. And remembering that the expectations may need to be adjusted based on the environment and the context and the stress. And I just love that, that visual, stealing my ability to make words. Like what a beautiful way to share that with us, right? So the words are there, but when you're stressed, sometimes that ability just disappears. Another piece I didn't really talk too much about tonight is how the internet, for many of my participants, finding the internet and finding resources from the autism community and finding blogs or groups or support groups. You know, I definitely understand parents who have fear around their kiddo being labeled or over-identifying, right? I just want them to be who they are. But in my experience and through my research, I found that really understanding their identity, connecting with it in a positive way helps them to find that community and real, authentic relationships. So I think, you know, Facebook, participant 4 was super depressed and Facebook turned it around. I mean, that was literally her quote. Once people started to know me and I actually had a platform. So I think that's really great. Recognize the pressure to fit in, that fitting in is not always the end all be all, right? I had a participant who was, she would come home at the end of the day and her boyfriend was like, gosh, you're so nice at work and you're so like rough around the edges with me. And she's like, yeah, I can take my retail face off. I can take this mask off and now finally be myself. And, you know, coming back to the scary side of this, which I don't want to harp on, but I do want to point out that, you know, anxiety and depression in adolescents with autism is a real thing. And one of my participants stated, I was diagnosed with depression and they tried different medications, but none of it addressed the social factors, the social components that led to the depression, right? So again, looking not just at, you know, the neurology and placing it on a deficit, quote unquote, of the individual, but looking at our society and how we view and handle and treat individuals with disabilities, just super important. And then I learned so much through this process, you know, being laughed at by Nick Walker when I said, how about a phone interview? He's like, we don't want to be on the phone with you. I'm like, okay. But just recognizing the output and writing. There was a lot of positives in the research around typing and talking through writing and how much easier it was. And so that's why, you know, I chose that method for my data collection. So I think in conclusion, Olivia was, that was her pseudonym she chose for the follow-up interviews, which maybe someday will be at part 2 and we'll dive more into Olivia. But I thought her share was really important. I asked her if she could share anything with people who work with people with autism or have children with autism, what would she say? And she said, I guess I'd say be patient with them and don't be afraid to play along. You can find out a lot from what they say and it can help them. But it's also okay to tell them that most people don't script like they do, as long as you explain it in a way that doesn't make them feel like freaks or something, because they're not alone. Pretty well said, with the balance between the benefits, but also recognizing that the world is not always that safe and accepting place that we want it to be or that we try to create for our kiddos. All right. Again, I know I just appreciate you all for being here. And I think what I would push you to do is, if anything I said today made you think or pushed against maybe some of the views that you've held in the past, grapple with that a little bit. Click on some of the links, look up some of the folks who have these beliefs. And, you know, again, we all fall in different places in regards to, you know, how progressive we are on the disability. It's all a continuum. So I would just push you to maybe read a little bit more if there was something that struck you today that made you feel uncomfortable, because I think those are the potential places to grow. And there may be things, you know, fundamentally that we disagree with, and that's okay too. But I think listening to the voice and really empowering those who have the firsthand experience is just, it's critical. So thanks for coming.